Sometimes the most powerful people in the world are those whom society has forgotten. Sometimes the greatest acts of love happen in the most unlikely places. In ancient times, slave markets were places where human worth was measured in coin. Emperor Daran stood among the crowd, disguised as a common man. When a small girl with a twisted leg was brought forward, the nobles laughed. "Who would want broken goods?" they said. The child was maybe 7 years old, wearing rags, but she held her head high with quiet dignity. Then the emperor stepped forward and said the words that would change everything. "I want the crippled little girl." The crowd mocked him. They thought he was foolish. But what they didn't know was that this simple act would transform an entire empire. What could one broken child offer the most powerful man alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 15 years earlier, Emperor Daran of Crippled had been a different man entirely. In those days, his name struck fear into the hearts of neighboring kingdoms, and his armies swept across the desert lands like sandstorms, conquering everything in their path. The imperial seal of compassion, a jade carving depicting a strong hand gently cradling a dove, had not yet been crafted. Instead, his seal bore the image of a roaring lion, teeth bared, ready to devour any who dared oppose him. The transformation began with tragedy, as most profound changes do. Daran's beloved wife, Empress Lydia, and their only daughter, little Mira, fell victim to the plague that swept through Cripled's capital during the summer of his 10th year of reign. He could still remember Mira's laugh, bright as temple bells, and the way she would run to greet him, despite his intimidating armor and stern countenance. She had been 8 years old, with eyes like desert stars and a spirit that could soften even his warrior's heart. The plague took them within days of each other. All his power, all his armies, all his gold, none of it could save the two people who mattered most. Daran had raged against the gods, against fate, against the very foundations of his empire. He had locked himself away for months, emerging only to conduct the most necessary affairs of state. His heart turned to stone, but grief, when it runs its course, either destroys a man completely or transforms him into something he never imagined he could become. For Daran, it was the latter. Standing at his daughter's grave marker in the royal gardens, watching the desert wind scatter sand across the carved inscription of her name, he had made a vow that would reshape not just his own soul, but the very nature of his empire. "Never again," he had whispered to the silent stone, "never again will I let suffering go unnoticed in my realm." The empire of Crippled stretched across vast desert lands, where ancient cities rose like jewels from the golden sand. Trade routes crisscrossed the territory like arteries, bringing merchants from distant lands with their caravans of silk, spices, and precious metals. The capital city, also called Crippled, stood as a testament to both wealth and power, its sandstone walls gleaming amber in the perpetual sunshine, its towers reaching toward the cloudless sky like prayers made manifest. Within the palace walls, Daran had gathered around him advisors who understood his new vision. General Marcus, his closest friend since childhood, had been skeptical at first when Daran began speaking of mercy and justice rather than conquest and dominance. Marcus was a practical man, scarred from countless battles, his loyalty absolute, but his patience for what he called soft policies limited. Yet over the years, he had seen how Daran's new approach had brought unprecedented prosperity to Crippled. People worked harder when they weren't afraid, traded more freely when they trusted their ruler, and fought more fiercely to defend a homeland that valued their lives. Elena, the court's chief advisor, possessed a mind sharp as any blade and wisdom that seemed to flow from some deeper well of understanding. She had been the first to support Daran's transformation, perhaps seeing in his grief-born compassion the seeds of true greatness. Her silver hair was always braided with threads of gold, and her dark eyes missed nothing that happened within the court's intricate web of relationships and rivalries. Daran, the court physician, had initially served the royal family in a traditional capacity, treating wounds, mixing healing potions, and attending to the various ailments that plagued even the most powerful. But under Daran's new reign, his role had expanded. Now he traveled throughout the empire, establishing healing houses for the poor, training local healers, and ensuring that the emperor's vision of compassion reached even the most remote villages. The slave trade had always been a necessary evil in Caleth, or so Daran had been taught. The empire's prosperity depended partly on the labor provided by captured enemies and those sold into bondage by neighboring kingdoms facing famine or war. But as his heart changed, so did his perspective on this ancient practice. He couldn't abolish it outright. The economic disruption would be catastrophic, and his nobles would revolt. Instead, he had begun implementing reforms, better conditions for slaves, paths to earn freedom, prohibitions against the most brutal treatment. Still, the slave markets remained, and they served as a constant reminder of the distance between his ideals and reality. Sometimes, when the weight of compromise became too heavy, Daran would disguise himself in the simple robes of a merchant or craftsman and walk among his people. These journeys always taught him something about the gap between palace policy and street reality, about the concerns of ordinary citizens, about the human cost of the decisions made in marble halls. The political landscape of the known world was shifting like desert sand in those days. To the north lay the kingdom of Vaelthorn, ruled by Queen Seraphina, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ruthless cunning. Relations with Vaelthorn remained cordial but tense, built on a foundation of mutual respect and mutual wariness. To the east, the Shadowlands Empire grew in power under the iron fist of various warlords who rose and fell like violent storms, leaving devastation in their wake. And to the south, the free cities maintained their independence through a complex web of alliances and trade agreements that required constant diplomatic attention. Within Caleth itself, not everyone embraced their emperor's new philosophy. Duke Cassius, whose ancestral lands provided much of the empire's grain, had grown increasingly vocal in his criticism of what he called Daran's weakness. Cassius was a man of old-fashioned values who believed that strength came from the sword and that mercy was a luxury that empires couldn't afford. His supporters in the court whispered that Daran had grown soft since his family's death, that grief had clouded his judgment and made him unfit to rule. These tensions simmered beneath the surface of court life like underground springs, occasionally bubbling up in heated council meetings or whispered conversations in shadowed corridors. Daran was aware of the criticism, but he had learned to judge his policies by their results rather than their popularity. Crime had decreased throughout the empire, trade had flourished, and most importantly, his people seemed genuinely happier than they had been during his years of iron-fisted rule. Yet sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Daran would stand on his balcony overlooking the capital and wonder if he was truly making the right choices. The burden of leadership had never felt heavier than when it was guided by conscience rather than simple expedience. Every decision now required him to balance competing goods rather than simply choosing the most expedient path to victory. On this particular morning, as the sun began its climb over the eastern walls of the city, Daran felt that familiar restlessness that sometimes overtook him. There were no pressing matters of state, no wars to plan, no diplomatic crises to resolve, no immediate threats to address. Perhaps that was why the restlessness felt stronger than usual. In the absence of external challenges, his mind turned inward, to the questions that had no easy answers. Elena found him there on the balcony, as she often did, her soft footsteps barely audible on the marble floor. "You're thinking too much again," she said without preamble, joining him at the stone railing that overlooked the city. "Is there such a thing as thinking too much when the decisions affect so many lives?" Daran asked, not taking his eyes from the vista below. The city was already stirring to life, merchants opening their stalls, children running through narrow streets. The eternal dance of human existence, continuing as it had for countless generations. There is when the thinking becomes paralysis, Elena replied gently. You've made good decisions, Daran. The Empire is stronger and more prosperous than it's ever been. Sometimes you need to trust that the foundation you've built will hold. Daran smiled slightly at her words. Elena had a gift for cutting through his self-doubt with practical wisdom. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps what I need is to get out among the people again. It's been too long since I've walked the streets as just another citizen. The slave market? Elena asked, reading his thoughts with the accuracy that came from years of friendship and shared purpose. Yes, Daran said, finally turning to look at her. It's been months since I've seen firsthand how our reforms are working there. And I find that the slave market tells me more about the soul of our empire than any report from my administrators. Elena nodded thoughtfully. The slave market was indeed a barometer of their society's values, a place where the gap between ideal and reality was most starkly visible. Shall I arrange for guards to accompany you? No, Daran said firmly. Just the usual disguise. If I'm to see the truth, I need to see it as my people do, not through the lens of imperial protection. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sandstone buildings in shades of gold and amber, Emperor Daran prepared for another of his anonymous journeys into the heart of his empire. He had no way of knowing that this particular excursion would change not only his own life, but the destiny of Calith itself. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest decisions, the choice to look beyond the palace walls, to step outside the bubble of power and to see the world through eyes unclouded by position or privilege. By mid-morning, dressed in the rough-spun robes of a middle-class merchant, his distinctive beard trimmed shorter and his bearing deliberately ordinary, Daran set out for the slave markets of Calith. The morning air carried the scents of cooking bread, incense from the temples, and the ever-present hint of desert sand that flavored everything in their city. His steps carried him through familiar streets that looked entirely different when viewed from ground level. Rather than imperial balconies, he had no idea that fate was waiting for him in the dust and heat of the market square, wearing the face of a 7-year-old girl whose courage would soon shame the cowardice of grown men and whose wisdom would reshape an empire. Sometimes the most important meetings happen when we least expect them, in places we've been 100 times before, with people we almost don't notice until that one crucial moment when everything changes. The slave market of Calith sprawled across the eastern quarter of the city like a festering wound that refused to heal. Despite Daran's reforms, it remained a place where human dignity went to die, where flesh was bartered like grain and souls were priced by the pound. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the auction platform, a raised wooden stage stained dark with years of sweat, tears, and worse things that Daran preferred not to contemplate. Bronze bells rang out across the market square, their metallic voices cutting through the noise of haggling merchants and restless crowds. The slave market bell, that cursed instrument that announced each new lot of human misery, had been ringing for 3 hours when Daran arrived. Dressed in his merchant's disguise and keeping to the shadows at the edge of the crowd, the auctioneer, a corpulent man named Brutus, whose voice could carry across half the city, stood atop the platform like a grotesque carnival master. His assistant, a nervous young man with twitching hands, led the slaves onto the stage one by one, while Brutus called out their supposed virtues to the assembled buyers. "Strong backs for your quarries," Brutus bellowed, gesturing toward a group of captured warriors whose spirit hadn't yet been broken. Fresh from the northern campaigns, these ones still have fight in them, perfect for hard labor that would kill lesser men. The bidding was swift and brutal. Daran watched with a sick heart as human beings were reduced to their most basic functions: muscle for labor, beauty for pleasure, youth for endurance. The buyers showed all the emotion of farmers purchasing livestock, examining teeth, testing the firmness of limbs, discussing the slaves as if they were deaf to the humiliation. Lord Matthias, a textile merchant whose cruelty was legendary even among the slave-owning class, won the bid for two young women who couldn't have been more than 16. Daran knew what fate awaited them in Matthias's household, and it took all his self-control not to intervene immediately. But revealing himself now would accomplish nothing except to drive the trade deeper underground. "Next lot," Brutus called out, wiping sweat from his brow with a stained cloth. Fresh merchandise from the eastern provinces, domestic servants trained in the finest houses before their masters fell to debt. The parade continued, each new group of slaves representing another small tragedy, another family torn apart, another collection of dreams destroyed. Daran found himself thinking of Mira again, imagining his own daughter's horror if she could see this place. Would she understand the political necessities that kept him from simply shutting it down? Or would she look at him with those clear, judging eyes and ask why he allowed such suffering to continue? As the afternoon wore on, the quality of the slaves, if such a term could be applied to human beings, began to decline. The strong workers and attractive servants had been sold off to the highest bidders. What remained were the damaged goods, the desperate cases, the slaves that even this callous market viewed as barely worth the trouble. "Now then," Brutus said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that made Daran's skin crawl, "we come to our final offering of the day. I'll be honest with you, good citizens, this one's more of a charity case than a proper slave." A murmur of cruel laughter rippled through the crowd as Brutus's assistant led a small figure onto the platform. Daran felt his breath catch in his throat as he saw her clearly for the first time. She was perhaps 7 years old, though malnutrition might have made her appear younger than her actual age. Her left leg was twisted, causing her to walk with a pronounced limp that made each step an obvious struggle. Her clothes were little more than rags, a torn brown tunic that had probably once belonged to someone 3 times her size, held together with bits of rope and stubborn hope. Her dark hair hung in tangled mats around a face that should have been round with childhood innocence, but was instead gaunt with hunger and hardship. But it was her eyes that struck Daran like a physical blow. They were large and dark, and in them he saw not the broken spirit he expected, but a quiet dignity that put the assembled nobles to shame. She clutched something in her small hands, a crude wooden doll, damaged and missing one arm, but held with the fierce protectiveness of a child who had very few possessions left in the world. "The girl comes from rebel stock," Brutus announced with evident distaste. Her parents were executed for treason against the crown, caught smuggling weapons to insurgents in the border territories. The child was injured during the raid that brought them to justice. As you can see, she's of limited use for physical labor, though she's young enough to train for lighter domestic duties if you have the patience. The crowd's reaction was immediate and cruel. Laughter erupted from various quarters, along with jeering comments that made Daran's hands clench into fists. Who would bid for broken flesh? Better to put the creature out of its misery. What use is a slave who can barely walk? Through it all, the little girl, Sarai, though Daran didn't yet know her name, stood on the platform with her chin raised, refusing to let the crowd's cruelty break her spirit. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't collapse under the weight of their contempt. She simply endured, holding her broken doll and waiting for whatever fate would befall her next. "Come now," Brutus said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a merchant desperate to clear unwanted inventory. "Surely someone has use for the child. She eats very little, takes up minimal space. Starting bid of 5 copper pieces, less than you'd pay for a decent meal." Silence greeted his words. Even 5 copper pieces seemed too much for a crippled child of executed traitors. Daran felt something breaking apart inside his chest as he watched the girl's small shoulders straighten further, as if she were drawing strength from their rejection rather than being crushed by it. 3 copper pieces, then," Brutus said, his desperation becoming more obvious. "Surely someone—" "I want the crippled little girl." The words left Daran's mouth before he fully realized he was going to speak them. They rang out across the suddenly silent market square with all the authority of an imperial decree. Though none of the assembled crowd recognized the voice of their emperor, Every head turned to stare at him as he stepped forward from the shadows at the edge of the crowd. Whispers began immediately. Who was this strange man who would waste money on damaged goods? What possible use could he have for a crippled child? Well then, Brutus said, clearly surprised but eager to close the sale. We have a bidder. 5 copper pieces for the girl. Do I hear any competing offers? The laughter that erupted from the crowd was even crueler than before, but now it was directed at Daran rather than the child. He heard the mocking comments as he made his way through the press of bodies toward the platform. The fool must be addled by the sun. What manner of man bids for broken flesh? Perhaps he's a collector of curiosities. But Daran heard none of it clearly. His entire focus was on the small figure standing on the platform, watching his approach with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. When he reached the front of the crowd and placed 5 copper pieces in the auctioneer's outstretched palm, Sarai tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel as if she were looking directly into his soul. The transaction completed, Brutus gestured impatiently for the girl to come down from the platform. She moved carefully, her twisted leg making the steps treacherous, but she refused the auctioneer's impatient offer of assistance. Instead, she made her way down on her own, maintaining that same quiet dignity that had first caught Daran's attention. When she reached the ground level and stood before him, Daran found himself at a loss for words. What did one say to a child whose entire world had just been reduced to a 5 copper transaction? How did one comfort someone who had already lost everything that mattered? Instead of speaking, he knelt down so that they were at eye level with each other. The crowd was already dispersing. Their entertainment concluded, their mockery trailing behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Up close, he could see that beneath the grime and malnutrition, she possessed a face of delicate beauty that spoke of good bloodlines, despite her parents' rebel status. "Are you going to hurt me too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the space between them. The question hit Daran like a sword thrust to the heart, too. The word contained volumes about what this child had already endured, about the cruelties that had been inflicted on someone who should have known nothing but protection and love. "Never," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "Never again will anyone hurt you. You have my word." For the first time since he had seen her, something flickered in those dark eyes, not quite hope, but perhaps the possibility of hope. She shifted her weight, favoring her good leg, and adjusted her grip on the broken wooden doll. "What's your name?" Daran asked gently. "Sarai," she replied, then added with the formal politeness that someone had taught her before the world fell apart, "My lord." "Just Daran," he said, "and you don't need to call me lord. We're going to go somewhere safe now, Sarai, somewhere you can rest and heal and be just a child again." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden cruelty. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she gave a small nod. "Will you carry my doll?" she asked, holding out the broken toy. "My leg hurts, and I don't want to drop her." "Of course," Daran said, accepting the crude wooden figure with the same reverence he might show a priceless artifact. "What's her name?" "Hope," Sarai said simply. "Her name is Hope." As they began the long walk back through the city toward the palace, Daran found himself carrying more than just a broken doll. He was carrying the weight of a promise, the responsibility of a life, and perhaps most importantly, the first real hope he had felt since standing at his daughter's grave all those years ago. He had no idea that this moment would be remembered in the history books as the day the empire began to change, when a ruler's compassion for one forgotten child would reshape the destiny of an entire realm. The journey back to the palace passed in a strange bubble of quiet conversation and careful observation. Sarai walked beside Daran with determined steps, though he could see the effort each one cost her. She asked no questions about their destination, but her dark eyes took in everything: the gradual improvement in the buildings they passed, the increasing wealth displayed in shop windows, the way people's clothing became finer as they moved toward the palace district. "The buildings are very tall here," she observed as they entered the noble quarter, her neck craning back to look at the ornate towers that rose like prayers toward the desert sky. "They are," Daran agreed. "Do you like tall buildings?" Sarai considered this seriously. "I think they make the people inside feel important, but they also make shadows for people who need to hide." The wisdom in her simple observation struck Daran silent for several steps. Here was a child who had learned to see the world from the perspective of those who lived in the shadows, who understood instinctively that height and power often came at the cost of those below. When the palace gates came into view, Sarai stopped walking. The massive sandstone walls stretched up toward the sky, topped with golden spires that caught the afternoon sun like captured fire. Guards in ceremonial armor stood at attention, their presence both magnificent and intimidating. "That's where we're going?" Sarai asked, and for the first time her voice carried a note of fear. "Yes," Daran said gently. "It's my home. And now it's yours too. I've never been in a palace before," she whispered. "What if I break something? What if I don't know how to act?" Daran knelt down beside her again, careful not to tower over her small frame. "Sarai, listen to me. In that palace live people who would sell children in markets, who measure worth by the color of someone's blood or the straightness of their limbs. You have more true nobility in your small finger than they have in their entire bodies. You cannot possibly disappoint me." The guards at the gate recognized Daran despite his disguise. They had been trained to know their emperor in any clothing, under any circumstances. Their eyes widened slightly when they saw the small, ragged girl beside him, but their discipline held. They opened the gates without question, though Daran could see the curiosity burning behind their professional masks. The palace courtyard stretched before them like a vision from a dream. Fountains sent crystalline water dancing toward the sky, their gentle music mixing with the songs of exotic birds kept in golden cages. Gardens bloomed with flowers that required constant care to survive in the desert climate. Their colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Sarai stopped again, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of such concentrated beauty. Her grip tightened on Daran's hand as servants began to notice their arrival and whisper among themselves. "It's very loud," she said quietly. Daran listened and realized she was right. The palace hummed with a constant low-level noise. Servants going about their duties, water flowing in the fountains, birds calling, the general bustle of a place where hundreds of people lived and worked. To someone accustomed to the harsh silence of survival, it must indeed seem overwhelming. "Would you like to see your room first?" he asked. "Somewhere quiet where you can rest." She nodded gratefully, and Daran led her through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Past tapestries worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Beneath carved ceilings that told the story of Caleth's ancient glory. Servants they passed stopped their work to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed shock. The room Daran had decided to give her had once belonged to Mira. He had kept it exactly as it was the day his daughter died, but now he realized that preserving it as a shrine served no one. Better that it should house another child who needed sanctuary, who deserved to know safety and comfort. When he opened the door, Sarai gasped. The room was larger than most entire houses, with windows that looked out over the gardens and walls decorated with murals of desert flowers and soaring birds. A bed dominated one side of the space, not just a bed, but a massive construction of carved wood and soft fabrics that could have slept 6 people comfortably. "This is for me?" Sarai asked, her voice barely audible. "It is," Daran confirmed. "And this?" He reached into a leather pouch that had been waiting on a side table and pulled out a collection of healing herbs carefully prepared by Daran. "Is medicine to help your leg feel better. The palace physician will want to examine you properly, but this should help with any pain you're feeling now." Sarai accepted the small leather pouch with the same reverence she had shown everything else, cradling it carefully in her small hands. "A real physician, to look at my leg." "The finest in the empire," Daran assured her. "But first you should rest and eat." When did you last have a proper meal? The question seemed to confuse her. I don't remember, she said finally. Before the soldiers came, maybe? Daran felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that had become his constant companion since Mira's death. How long had this child been surviving on scraps and charity? How many days had she gone to sleep hungry, wondering if morning would bring food or just another day of emptiness? Within the hour, the room had been transformed. Servants had brought warm water for washing, fresh clothes in her size, and enough food to feed a small army. Sarai sat on the edge of the enormous bed, looking lost in the sea of luxury that surrounded her. I don't know where to start, she admitted, gesturing helplessly at the feast spread before her. Wherever you want, Daran said. There's no wrong choice here. She chose bread first, simple brown bread with butter and honey. She ate it slowly, savoring each bite as if she were afraid it might disappear if she enjoyed it too much. Daran watched her careful, deliberate motions and recognized the behavior of someone who had learned not to take sustenance for granted. As the sun began to set outside her windows, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, Sarai finally began to relax. The healing herbs were taking effect, easing the constant ache in her twisted leg, and the warm food had brought color back to her pale cheeks. Why did you choose me? She asked suddenly, looking up from the cup of warm milk she had been sipping. In the market, I mean. Why me when everyone said I was worthless? Daran was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that would convey the truth without overwhelming her with the weight of his own grief and transformation. Because they were wrong, he said finally. And because sometimes the most important people are the ones everyone else overlooks. You reminded me of someone very important to me, someone who taught me that real strength has nothing to do with perfect bodies or noble blood. Your daughter, Sarai said, not making it a question. Daran's surprise must have shown on his face, because she smiled slightly, the first real smile he had seen from her. You have sad eyes when you talk about important people, she explained. And this room used to belong to a little girl. I can tell because of the paintings on the walls and the way you touched the bed, like it was precious. You're very observant, Daran said softly. You have to be. When you're different, Sarai replied matter-of-factly. People think that because your body doesn't work right, your mind doesn't work either. So you learn to see things they miss. That night, as Daran tucked her into the massive bed that had once been Mira's, Sarai looked up at him with those two wise eyes. Will I have nightmares here? She asked. You might, Daran said honestly. But if you do, I'll be just down the hall. You're not alone anymore, Sarai. You never have to be alone again. As he prepared to leave, she called out softly, Daran? Yes. Thank you for wanting me. The words followed him down the corridor and into his own chambers, where he stood for a long time, looking out at the lights of his city and wondering how one small girl had already begun to change the rhythm of his heart. 3 weeks had passed since Sarai's arrival at the palace, and the rhythm of her new life had begun to take shape like a song finding its melody. Each morning she would wake to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of her room, and for just a moment she would forget where she was. Then memory would return, not the harsh memories of the market or her parents' death, but the gentler memory of safety, of belonging to someone who wanted her. Her days had structure now, something she had never experienced before. After breakfast with Daran in his private dining chamber, a routine that had shocked the kitchen staff but delighted them both, she would spend the morning hours with Elena, learning to read and write. The older woman had infinite patience for Sarai's questions, which ranged from the practical to the philosophical, with startling speed. Why do some letters look angry and others look happy? Sarai asked one morning, studying the elegant script that Elena was teaching her to copy. Letters don't have feelings, Elena replied gently, though she was smiling. But the person writing them does. When you write with care and attention, the letters become beautiful. When you rush or feel careless, they look harsh. Sarai considered this seriously, then bent over her parchment with renewed concentration. Her twisted leg made it difficult for her to sit properly at the writing desk, but she had fashioned a system of cushions that allowed her to work comfortably. Watching her adapt so naturally to her physical limitations filled Elena with admiration for the child's resourcefulness. The afternoons belonged to Daran, the court physician, who had become fascinated by Sarai's case. Not just her injured leg, but her remarkable resilience. She had survived malnutrition, trauma, and abandonment, yet her mind remained sharp and her spirit unbroken. The bone healed incorrectly, Daran explained to Daran after one of their sessions. But with proper exercises and time, we can improve her mobility significantly. She'll always have some limitation, but she need not live in constant pain. The physical therapy sessions had become something Sarai actually looked forward to. Daran had a gentle manner and a gift for making the exercises feel like games rather than medical treatment. More importantly, he treated her as an intelligent person rather than a broken object to be fixed. But it was the evenings that Sarai treasured most, when Daran would visit her room and they would talk about anything and everything. Sometimes he would tell her stories of Caleth's history, of the great rulers who had come before him and the challenges they had faced. Other times she would share memories of her parents, not the painful final days, but the good times when her father would carve wooden toys and her mother would sing old songs while braiding her hair. It was during one of these evening conversations that Daran presented her with a gift that would change everything. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small wrapped bundle from beneath his robes. "It belonged to someone very special to me, and I think she would have wanted you to have it." Sarai unwrapped the soft cloth carefully, her breath catching when she saw what lay within. It was a hair comb, delicate and beautiful, made of gold, so fine it seemed to capture and hold the lamplight. Tiny gemstones were embedded along its edge, creating a pattern of flowers that seemed to dance in the flickering illumination. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she whispered, running one finger gently along the comb's surface. "It was Mira's," Daran said softly. "My daughter's. She would have been about your age now if—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but Sarai understood. "Are you sure you want me to have it?" she asked, looking up at him with eyes full of concern. "What if something happens to it? What if I lose it or break it?" "Then we'll deal with that if it happens," Daran replied. "But Sarai, beautiful things are meant to be used and enjoyed, not locked away in boxes." Mira would want her comb to make another little girl feel special. That night, as Sarai carefully worked the golden comb through her clean, detangled hair, she felt something she had never experienced before, the sensation of being truly cherished. Not just cared for or protected, but valued for who she was, rather than what she could provide. But not everyone in the palace shared Daran's view of their newest resident. The whispers that had begun on her first day had grown into open conversations, and those conversations were beginning to reach Daran's ears through the complex network of palace gossip. "The Emperor has lost his mind," Lady Cordelia, one of the minor nobles, had been heard saying at a recent court gathering, adopting a crippled slave girl as if she were royal blood. "It's unseemly, worse than unseemly," Lord Matthias had replied. "It's dangerous. What message does this send to our enemies? That Caleth has grown so weak, we coddle our slaves instead of commanding them." Duke Cassius, who had been growing bolder in his criticism with each passing week, took a different approach. Rather than attacking Sarai directly, he questioned Daran's fitness to rule. "The Emperor's grief has clouded his judgment," Cassius said during a council meeting that Sarai accidentally overheard while passing through a nearby corridor. "First he weakens our military with his compassionate reforms. Now he elevates a slave child above the noble families who have served this empire for generations. How long before he names her his heir?" The words hit Sarai like physical blows. She pressed herself against the wall outside the council chamber, her heart racing as she listened to the men inside discuss her as if she were a political problem to be solved, rather than a child who simply wanted to belong somewhere. "The girl is a symbol of everything wrong with our current leadership," another voice added, one she didn't recognize. She represents weakness, disguised as virtue, sentiment masquerading as wisdom. Sarai fled down the corridor as quietly as her twisted leg would allow, her mind reeling from what she had heard. She had known that some people disapproved of her presence, but hearing it spoken so bluntly, hearing herself described as a source of weakness and danger, made her feel sick to her stomach. When Daran found her later that evening, curled up in the window seat of her room, with tears streaming down her face, he immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, settling beside her and gently taking her hands in his. "I heard them talking," she said through her tears. "The men in the council chamber. They think I'm making you weak. They think you're not fit to rule because you were kind to me." Daran felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "And what do you think about what they said?" "I think maybe they're right," Sarai whispered. "Maybe I am making things harder for you. Maybe I should go away so you can be a proper emperor again." "Sarai, look at me," Daran said firmly but gently. When she raised her tear-stained face to his, he continued, "Those men measure strength by how much suffering they can cause and endure. They think that caring about others makes a person weak. But I've learned something they haven't. True strength comes from having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. But what if they try to hurt you because of me?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Then we'll face that together," Daran replied, "because that's what families do. They stand by each other no matter what storms come." "Family?" Sarai repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. "Family," Daran confirmed, "if you want to be." For the first time since arriving at the palace, Sarai threw her arms around Daran's neck and held on tight. "Papa," she whispered into his shoulder. The word muffled but unmistakable. Outside her window, the first stars were appearing in the desert sky, and somewhere in the distance, the palace bells chimed the hour. But in that moment, none of the politics or problems mattered. There was only a father and daughter finding each other across the wreckage of their separate griefs, creating something new and precious from the broken pieces of their hearts. 6 months had transformed Sarai from the frightened, malnourished child who had stood on the auction platform into someone almost unrecognizable. Her twisted leg, while still requiring careful attention, no longer caused her constant pain, thanks to Daran's patient treatment and her own determined effort in following his prescribed exercises. She walked with only a slight limp now, and more importantly, she carried herself with a confidence that spoke of someone who knew she belonged where she was. Her mind, always sharp, had flourished under Elena's careful tutelage. She could now read and write with a fluency that impressed even the most scholarly members of the court. And her questions had evolved from simple curiosity to sophisticated inquiries that sometimes left her teachers scrambling for adequate answers. But it was during the strategy lessons that Daran had begun, including in her education, that Sarai's true gifts became apparent. She possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed her to see through complex political situations to their essential core, and her suggestions often carried a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "The grain merchants are complaining again about the tax rates," Daran explained during one of their evening sessions, spreading maps and trade documents across the low table in her room. "They claim the current levies will force them to raise prices, which will hurt the common people." Sarai studied the documents carefully, her finger tracing the trade routes that connected Caliph to its neighboring regions. "But if they lower the taxes, where will the money come from to maintain the roads they use? And to pay for the guards who protect their caravans?" "Exactly the question," Daran said, pleased by her immediate grasp of the issue. "What would you suggest?" "What if we offered them a choice?" Sarai said thoughtfully. "They could pay the full tax and receive guaranteed protection and road maintenance, or pay a reduced tax but take responsibility for their own security and repairs. The ones who are truly struggling would choose the lower tax, and the ones who are just being greedy would pay the full amount rather than risk their profits." Daran stared at her for a moment, then began to laugh, not mockingly but with genuine delight. "That's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. It gives them agency while still ensuring the Empire's needs are met. But even as Sarai's abilities became more apparent to those who worked closely with her, the opposition to her presence grew stronger and more organized. The court had divided into distinct factions, those who supported Daran's decision and had come to appreciate Sarai's unique perspective, and those who viewed her as a dangerous aberration that threatened the natural order. Duke Cassius had emerged as the unofficial leader of the latter group, and his influence was growing. The ancestral crown of Caliph, that ancient symbol of legitimate rule that had been passed down through 40 generations of emperors, seemed to weigh more heavily on Daran's head with each passing day, as whispers about succession and bloodlines echoed through the palace corridors. The precedent he's setting is dangerous, Cassius argued during a private dinner with several other nobles. Today he elevates a slave girl. Tomorrow he might decide that birth and breeding mean nothing at all. Where does it end? With stable boys claiming noble titles, with peasants demanding seats in the council. Lord Matthias, still smarting from the memory of Daran's interference in his treatment of slaves, nodded vigorously. The Emperor has lost sight of the natural order that keeps our society stable. Someone needs to remind him of his duties to his bloodline and his empire. These conversations took place in shadowed corners and private chambers, but the palace had ears, and word eventually reached Elena's attention. She brought her concerns to Daran during their weekly strategic meeting, her usual calm demeanor showing signs of strain. The opposition is becoming more organized, she reported, closing the door to his private study carefully before continuing. Cassius has been meeting with representatives from neighboring kingdoms, ostensibly about trade agreements. But my sources suggest the conversations have ranged far beyond commerce. Daran looked up from the scroll he had been reading, his expression growing serious. What kind of conversations? Questions about succession, about the stability of our government, about whether Caliph can be counted on as a reliable ally if its leadership has become, and I quote, unpredictably sentimental. The words hung in the air between them like poison clouds. Daran set down his scroll and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of leadership settling more heavily on his shoulders. They're trying to isolate us diplomatically, he said after a moment. Make our neighbors question our strength and reliability, so they'll be more open to alternative arrangements. It appears so, Elena confirmed. And there's more. Foreign ambassadors have been asking pointed questions about your health, about your mental state, about whether the loss of your family affected your judgment. Daran stood and walked to the window that overlooked the palace gardens, where he could see Sarai working with Daran on her physical exercises. Even from this distance, he could see her determination, the way she pushed herself to overcome the limitations others saw as insurmountable. They think loving her makes me weak, he said quietly. They think loving anyone makes a ruler weak, Eleanor replied. It's an old philosophy that true power requires the ability to sacrifice anything and anyone for the good of the state. And what do you think? Elena joined him at the window, watching as Sarai successfully completed a complex balance exercise that would have been impossible for her just months earlier. I think they're about to learn the difference between weakness and strength the hard way. That evening's lesson with Sarai took on a different tone than usual. Instead of trade routes and tax policies, Daran found himself explaining the more complex realities of power and opposition. Some people in the court don't think I should be here, Sarai said matter-of-factly, settling into her favorite chair with a cup of warm milk. I know because they're not very good at whispering quietly. Daran was constantly amazed by her ability to cut straight to the heart of issues that adults spent hours dancing around. And how do you feel about that? Scared sometimes, she admitted. Not for me, but for you. I don't want my being here to cause you problems. Sarai, listen to me carefully, Daran said, moving his chair closer to hers so he could look directly into her eyes. The problems were already there. The people who oppose us now opposed compassion and justice long before you arrived. You didn't create the conflict. You just made it impossible for them to hide behind polite words and noble intentions. But what if they try to hurt you? She asked, echoing her earlier fears. Then we'll be ready for them, Daran replied. But more importantly, what if they try to hurt you? Sarai was quiet for a long moment, considering the question, with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. Then I guess we'll find out what I'm really made of, she said finally. That night, as Daran made his final rounds through the palace before retiring to his chambers, he found himself thinking about the crown that awaited him in his bedroom, that ancient symbol of authority that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. But he also thought about the small girl sleeping peacefully down the hall, who faced each new challenge with a courage that put seasoned warriors to shame. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opposition, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, for just a few more hours, they could rest in the illusion of safety and the certainty of love. The crown might weigh heavy, but the heart it protected had learned to bear that weight with grace. The announcement came during the morning council session, delivered with all the ceremonial weight that such momentous declarations required. Daran stood before the assembled nobles, his voice carrying clearly through the marble halls as he spoke words that would echo through the empire's history. It is my intention to formally adopt Sarai as my daughter and heir, with all the rights and responsibilities that such a position entails. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a single sandal dropping would have echoed like thunder. Then, as if a dam had burst, the chamber erupted into chaos. Voices rose in protest, shock, and in a few cases grudging support. Duke Cassius's face had gone purple with rage, while Lord Matthias appeared to be choking on his own outrage. "Your Majesty," Cassius managed to say, when the initial furor had died down enough for him to be heard, "surely you cannot be serious. An adopted heir? A former slave? This violates every tradition our empire holds sacred." "Traditions," Daran replied calmly, "are meant to serve the people, not the other way around. When traditions become chains that prevent us from doing what is right, it is time to forge new ones." Elena watched the proceedings from her position near the throne, her hand resting inconspicuously near the ceremonial scrolls that would formalize the adoption. Scrolls themselves were works of art, crafted from the finest parchment, written in gold ink and bearing the official seals of the empire. But more than their physical beauty, they represented something revolutionary, the idea that family could be chosen rather than merely inherited. "The nobles of neighboring kingdoms will never accept her," Lord Matthias interjected, his voice shaking with emotion. "They'll see this as a sign of weakness, of madness even. You're jeopardizing our diplomatic relationships for the sake of a child who has no rightful claim to power." "She has the only claim that matters," Daran replied firmly. "She has proven herself worthy through her actions, her wisdom and her character. Blood is an accident of birth. Worth must be earned." The debate continued for hours, growing more heated with each exchange. Some nobles stormed out in protest, others remained to voice their continued opposition, and a smaller group, led by Elena and General Marcus, spoke in support of the Emperor's decision. Through it all, Sarai remained in her room, unaware of the political earthquake being generated in her name. She was working on her daily lessons, carefully copying a passage from one of Caleth's historical texts, when a servant rushed in with news of what was happening in the council chamber. "The Emperor is announcing your adoption," the young woman said breathlessly, "making you his heir. The whole court is in an uproar." Sarai set down her pen carefully, her hand trembling slightly. She had known this moment might come. Daran had spoken to her about it in theoretical terms, but the reality felt overwhelming. To go from unwanted slave to imperial heir in less than a year seemed like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. "What are they saying?" she asked quietly. "Some are angry," the servant admitted. "Others are scared. But some are saying it's the bravest thing any emperor has ever done." That evening, When the formal proceedings had finally concluded and the last of the protesting nobles had departed, Daran found Sarai in the palace gardens. She was sitting by the fountain, watching the water dance in the lamplight, her expression thoughtful and subdued. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the stone bench. "Fears," she corrected. "I'm not afraid for me, not anymore. But I'm terrified of what this will mean for you, for the Empire. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I make the wrong decisions, and people suffer because of them?" Daran was quiet for a moment, watching the play of light on water and remembering another conversation years ago with a different little girl who had asked similar questions about responsibility and worthiness. "Do you know what Mira used to worry about?" he said finally. "She was afraid that because she was born to be empress, people would expect her to be perfect. She was terrified of disappointing anyone or making mistakes that would hurt the empire." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that the very fact she worried about those things proved she was exactly the kind of person who should have power. The people who never question their own judgment, who never fear making mistakes, those are the ones we should be afraid of." Sarai absorbed this wisdom, turning it over in her mind like a precious stone. "The nobles who are angry, they think I don't deserve this because I wasn't born to it. And what do you think?" "I think maybe that's exactly why I should have it," she said slowly. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing, to be powerless, to be treated as if I don't matter. Maybe someone who has experienced that can make better decisions for people who are still living that way." The assassination attempt came 3 days later. Daran was making one of his regular appearances in the marketplace, not disguised this time, but in full imperial regalia, showing himself to the people as he did monthly to maintain connection with his subjects. Sarai had insisted on accompanying him, despite the obvious security concerns. "If I'm going to be your heir," she had argued with the same logical precision she brought to everything, "then I need to learn how to be with our people. I can't lead them if I don't know them." It was General Marcus who spotted the assassin. First, a man in merchant's clothes whose hand moved too quickly toward a concealed blade when the imperial party approached his stall. But it was Sarai who called out the warning, her young voice cutting through the marketplace noise like a bell. "Papa," the man with the green turban, "he's reaching for something." Her quick thinking and sharp eyes saved Daran's life. Marcus and the other guards subdued the would-be assassin before he could strike, and the crowd's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of panic or fear, there was admiration for the young girl who had protected their emperor with her vigilance. But among the watching nobles, the reaction was mixed. Some saw courage and quick thinking. Others saw a dangerous precedent, a former slave giving orders to imperial guards, her word carrying enough weight to trigger immediate action. Duke Cassius, who had been notably absent from the marketplace visit, arrived at the palace that evening with a new proposal. "Clearly the emperor's safety is at risk," he announced to the hastily convened council. "And clearly his judgment regarding this girl has made him vulnerable to his enemies. For the good of the empire, I propose that we arrange suitable guardianship for the child, somewhere safe away from court, where she cannot be used as a weapon against our sovereign." "You mean imprisonment," Elena said coldly. "I mean protection," Cassius replied smoothly. "Protection for her and protection for the empire from those who would exploit our emperor's affection for personal gain." The proposal split the court even more deeply than the adoption announcement had. The divide was no longer just about tradition versus progress. It had become about the fundamental nature of power and who deserved to wield it. That night, as Sarai practiced the combat techniques that General Marcus had begun teaching her as a precaution, she reflected on how quickly her world could change. One moment she was a child learning to read, the next she was the center of a struggle that could determine the Empire's future. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Daran asked, watching her work through the defensive movements with surprising grace despite her physical limitations. "I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this," she replied, completing a complex series of strikes and blocks. "But I think maybe that's the point. Maybe the best we can do is face it with courage and try to stay true to what we believe is right. Outside, storm clouds continued to gather, and the wind carried whispers of change that would soon transform from murmurs into the roar of approaching thunder. The adoption scrolls lay prepared and waiting, but the path to formalizing Sarai's position had become a gauntlet that would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The formal adoption ceremony had been planned for the following week, with representatives from across the empire summoned to witness this unprecedented moment in Caleth's history. The palace hummed with preparation, banquet halls being decorated, guest quarters prepared, and security protocols reviewed and strengthened in light of the recent assassination attempt. It was during these preparations that Brother Marcus, the elderly keeper of the palace archives, made his way to Daran's private study with trembling hands and eyes bright with discovery. The old scholar had spent his entire adult life among the dusty scrolls and ancient texts that documented Caleth's long history, and he moved through the archives with the confidence of someone who knew every corner of his domain. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice quavering with excitement and perhaps a touch of fear, "I have found something that changes everything." Daran looked up from the guest lists he had been reviewing, noting the unusual urgency in the normally placid scholar's demeanor. "What is it, Brother Marcus?" The old man carefully placed a stone tablet on the desk, its surface covered with ancient script that predated the current written language of Caleth by several centuries. The ancient prophecy tablet was clearly old, its edges worn smooth by time, its carved letters filled with centuries of accumulated dust and grime. "I was researching historical precedents for imperial adoption," Brother Marcus explained, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. "Looking for any examples that might support your decision when I found this, hidden behind a false wall in the deepest part of the archives. It appears to have been deliberately concealed." Daran studied the tablet, recognizing some of the archaic symbols, but unable to read the full text. "What does it say?" Brother Marcus pulled out a scroll containing his translation, his hands still trembling slightly. "It's a prophecy, Your Majesty, written by the Oracle of the Desert Stars during the reign of Emperor Khalid the Wise, over 300 years ago." He cleared his throat and began to read. "In the time when the realm grows heavy with its own power, when tradition becomes chain and strength becomes weakness, there shall come one who is broken in body but whole in spirit. Marked by suffering, wise beyond years, she shall be chosen not by blood but by love. The broken child shall heal the realm, making whole what was divided, bringing light to what was dark. But first, the realm shall be tested by fire, and only through that testing shall the truth of the prophecy be revealed." The silence that followed was profound. Daran felt as if the very air in the room had changed, becoming charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "How certain are you of this translation?" he asked finally. "Completely certain, Your Majesty. I've had it verified by the 3 most senior linguists in the Empire. The text is authentic, and there can be no doubt about its meaning." Daran read through the translation again, each phrase seeming to align perfectly with Sarai's story. Broken in body, her twisted leg. Marked by suffering, the loss of her parents, her time as a slave. Wise beyond years, her remarkable insights and understanding. Chosen not by blood but by love, their father-daughter bond that had formed despite having no genetic connection. "Who else knows about this?" Daran asked. "Only the linguists who helped with the translation, and they've sworn oaths of secrecy. But, Your Majesty, such a discovery cannot remain hidden for long. Word will spread, and when it does, everything changes," Daran finished. "The question is whether it changes for better or worse. The revelation of the prophecy transformed the political landscape overnight, though not in ways that anyone could have predicted. When Brother Marcus presented his findings to the full court 3 days later, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Those who had supported Sarai saw the prophecy as divine confirmation of what they had already believed that her elevation was not merely the emperor's whim, but part of a larger plan. Elena spoke eloquently about the wisdom of the ancients and the importance of recognizing destiny when it appeared. But the opposition, led by Duke Cassius, reacted with skepticism that bordered on accusation. "How convenient," Cassius declared during the emergency council session that followed the revelation, "that this supposed prophecy appears just when the emperor needs justification for his unprecedented decision. How do we know this tablet wasn't planted in the archives? How do we know this isn't an elaborate deception designed to give false legitimacy to an illegitimate choice?" Brother Marcus, despite his advanced age, drew himself up with dignity that silenced the murmuring nobles. "I have served this palace and its archives for 50 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I have dedicated my life to preserving truth, not creating convenient fictions. The tablet is genuine. Its age, its materials, its script, all verified by independent experts. To suggest otherwise is to accuse me of betraying everything I have held sacred." The argument raged for hours, with various nobles and advisors taking sides. Some demanded additional verification of the tablet's authenticity. Others argued that even if genuine, prophecies were notoriously unreliable and should not guide imperial policy. Still others suggested that the prophecy, if real, might refer to someone else entirely, but it was General Marcus who raised the most unsettling possibility. "The prophecy speaks of testing by fire," he said, his scarred face grave with concern. "If we accept that Sarai is the child described in this text, then we must also accept that Caliph is about to face some form of trial that will either validate or destroy everything we've built." As if summoned by his words, a messenger arrived that very evening with news that would prove the general's concerns prophetic. The message came from the eastern border fortresses, carried by a rider whose horse had collapsed from exhaustion just inside the city gates. "The Shadowlands Empire is mobilizing," the messenger gasped, still covered in the dust of his desperate journey. "Warlord Caven has united the scattered tribes under his banner and is marching toward our borders with the largest army seen in generations. Our scouts estimate their forces at nearly 50,000 strong." The war council that convened that night was unlike any in Caleth's recent history. Maps were spread across tables, supply lists tallied, and urgent messages dispatched to provincial governors and military commanders throughout the empire. But underlying all the practical preparations was the weight of the prophecy and what it might mean for the coming conflict. Warlord Caven is not known for his interest in territorial expansion, Elena observed, studying the intelligence reports. His previous campaigns have been raids for slaves and treasure, not wars of conquest. What's driving this sudden change in strategy? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarai, who had been quietly listening to the discussions from a corner of the room, spoke up with a clarity that cut through the military jargon and political speculation. "He's coming for me," she said simply. "Isn't he?" The adults in the room turned to stare at her, and Daran felt his heart sink as he realized she was probably right. "News of the prophecy will have reached the Shadowlands by now," General Marcus said grimly. "If Caven believes that capturing or killing Sarai will prevent the prophecy's fulfillment, then he'll see it as a way to defeat Caleth without having to overcome our armies," Daran finished. "Strike at the heart of what makes us strong, rather than confronting our strength directly." Sarai stood up from her chair, her young face serious beyond her years. "Then maybe it's time to find out what I'm really capable of," she said quietly. "The prophecy says the realm will be tested by fire. Maybe that testing has to include me too." Over the following days, as reports of the advancing Shadowlands army continued to arrive, the reality of the situation became clear. This was not going to be a simple border skirmish or a raid that could be repelled by local forces. Cavan had gathered the largest invasion force in living memory, and their target was not just Caleth's borders, but its very soul. The prophecy that had seemed like a blessing now felt like a burden of enormous weight. If Sarai truly was the broken child destined to heal the realm, then the coming war would be the test that proved or disproved that destiny. But prophecies, as any student of history knew, were notorious for fulfilling themselves in unexpected ways. As Daran stood on his balcony, watching the last light fade from the western sky, he found himself thinking about the tablet hidden in the archives for 3 centuries, waiting for exactly this moment to be discovered. Had the oracle of the desert stars truly seen this far into the future? Had she foreseen a crippled slave girl who would become the key to an empire's survival? Or was the prophecy simply giving voice to something deeper? The idea that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, that strength can emerge from brokenness, and that love might prove more powerful than blood in determining who deserves to lead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new preparations for the war that now seemed inevitable. But tonight, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daran allowed himself to hope that the ancient oracle's vision would prove true, that his daughter, his chosen child, his broken girl who had already healed his heart, might indeed have the power to heal an empire. The war room of the palace had been transformed into a nerve center of frenetic activity. Maps covered every available surface. Messengers came and went at all hours, and the steady stream of reports from the eastern borders painted an increasingly dire picture. Warlord Kavan's army had crossed into Caliph territory 3 days ago, moving with a speed and coordination that suggested months of careful planning. At the center of it all sat a detailed battle map, its surface marked with colored pins representing troop movements, supply lines, and strategic positions. The War Council map had become more than just a planning tool. It was a symbol of everything that stood between Caliph and destruction. Each mark on its surface represented not just military units, but the lives of thousands of soldiers and civilians who looked to their emperor for protection. General Marcus stood before the assembled War Council, his scarred face grim as he delivered the latest intelligence. Kavan's forces now number close to 60,000, larger than our initial estimates. He's been joined by mercenary companies from the far reaches of the Shadowlands, drawn by promises of rich plunder and easy victory. Easy victory? Duke Cassius interjected, his voice sharp with indignation. Does he think Caliph has grown so weak that we can be overrun by a collection of desert raiders? He thinks we've grown distracted, Elena replied quietly, her eyes never leaving the map. Our internal divisions have not gone unnoticed by our enemies. Govan believes that an empire arguing with itself cannot effectively defend itself. Daran studied the tactical situation with the eye of a commander who had once conquered half the known world. The enemy's strategy was sound. Strike fast and hard before Caliph could fully mobilize its defenses, aiming for the capital city where political chaos would amplify military defeat. What are our numbers? He asked General Marcus. 40,000 regulars, with another 20,000 militia and reserves that could be called up within a week. But Kavan won't give us a week. His forward scouts are already within a day's march of the outer settlements. It was then that Sarai spoke, her young voice cutting through the military discussions with startling clarity. "You're thinking about this wrong," she said, rising from her chair at the edge of the room where she had been quietly studying a smaller copy of the map. The assembled generals and nobles turned to look at her, some with skepticism, others with the grudging respect she had earned over the past months. General Marcus, who had come to value her insights, gestured for her to continue. "Kavan expects us to meet him head-on, army against army on ground of his choosing," Sarai explained, moving to the large map and pointing to the enemy's projected path. "But look at where he's marching, straight through the golden dunes, where the desert is at its most unforgiving. He's counting on speed to get his army through before the environment becomes a factor." "And?" Duke Cassius asked, his tone suggesting he saw little value in a child's military observations. "And that's exactly where we don't meet him," Sarai replied, her finger tracing alternative routes on the map. "The desert isn't our enemy, it's our ally. We know every water source, every hidden canyon, every place where the sand shifts unpredictably. Kevin's army doesn't. Eleanor leaned forward, studying the map with new interest. You're suggesting we use the terrain against them? Guerrilla tactics instead of conventional warfare? More than that, Sarai said, her excitement growing as the strategy crystallized in her mind. We let them think they're winning. We retreat before them, drawing them deeper into the desert, farther from their supply lines. Then when they're exhausted and demoralized, we strike from multiple directions at once. General Marcus was nodding slowly, his experienced eye seeing the potential in her unconventional approach. It's risky. If we miscalculate the timing, we could lose the capital without a fight. If we fight them conventionally, we lose anyway, Sarai pointed out. Their army is larger, and they have the initiative. But in the desert, numbers matter less than knowledge and endurance. The debate that followed was intense, with traditionalists like Duke Cassius arguing for a direct defense of the capital, while others began to see the wisdom in Sarai's asymmetric strategy. But it was Daran who ultimately made the decision that would shape the coming battle. We follow her plan, he announced, his voice carrying the authority that ended all argument. General Marcus, begin the preparations immediately. We're going to show Warlord Caven what happens when you invade a land whose secrets you don't know. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of activity unlike anything the palace had seen since Daran's own conquest campaigns. Messengers rode out to every corner of the empire carrying coded instructions. Supply depots were established in hidden locations throughout the desert. Civilian populations in the enemy's path were evacuated to fortified positions. Most importantly, the Imperial Army began its strategic withdrawal, falling back in good order while appearing to retreat in disorder. It was a complex deception that required perfect timing and discipline. Too convincing, and their own people would lose morale. Not convincing enough, and Caven would see through the ruse. Sarai threw herself into the preparations with an intensity that impressed even the most seasoned military professionals. Her knowledge of the desert, gained from years of surviving in its harshest regions, proved invaluable in planning supply routes and identifying defensive positions. More than that, her outsider's perspective allowed her to see tactical possibilities that experienced soldiers might overlook. The refugees, she said during one late-night planning session, studying reports of civilian movements. Caven's army will see them as a sign of their success, proof that we're in full retreat. But what if some of those refugees aren't what they appear to be? Explain, General Marcus said, his interest clearly piqued. Disguised soldiers, mixed in with the real civilian evacuees. They passed through enemy lines as fleeing peasants, then regrouped behind Caven's forces to attack his supply lines and communication networks. Eleanor smiled at the elegance of the deception. Use his expectations against him. He sees fleeing civilians and assumes victory, never realizing he's allowed our forces to get behind him. But even as the military preparations proceeded, the political situation within Caleth continued to deteriorate. Duke Cassius had grown increasingly vocal in his opposition to what he called following a child's fantasies into disaster. His faction argued that placing military strategy in the hands of an untested girl, prophecy or no prophecy, was tantamount to surrendering the empire to its enemies. The crisis came to a head when Cassius attempted his own version of a military coup, arriving at the palace with a small force of loyal guards and demanding that Daran step aside for the good of the empire until the current crisis passed. "You've lost your mind," Cassius declared during the confrontation in the throne room, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "First, you elevate a slave girl above noble blood. Now you're trusting our entire defense to her childish schemes. I cannot stand by and watch you destroy everything our ancestors built." General Marcus and his loyal troops had surrounded Cassius's forces before the Duke could act on his threats. But the damage was done. The attempted coup, even though it failed, had demonstrated just how deep the divisions within Caleth had become. "Stand down." "Cassius," Daran commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of imperial authority. "You swore an oath to serve this empire, not your own vision of what it should be. "I swore to serve an emperor worthy of the throne," Cassius replied. But his hand moved away from his weapon as he realized his position was hopeless. "Not a man whose judgment has been compromised by grief and sentimentality." "Then you're released from that oath," Daran said quietly. "Leave Caleth tonight. If you're found within our borders after sunrise, you'll be treated as an enemy of the state." As Cassius and his supporters departed under heavy guard, Sarai watched from the shadows of a side corridor. She had heard every word of the confrontation, and she understood the personal cost that Daran was paying for his loyalty to her. "You lost a duke because of me," she said when she found him later in his private chambers, staring out at the lights of the city below. "I lost a duke because of who I chose to become," Daran corrected gently. Cassius couldn't accept that strength comes in many forms, that wisdom doesn't require noble blood, and that sometimes the most important decisions are made with the heart rather than the head. "But now he's gone to Caven," Sarai said, voicing the fear they both shared. "He'll tell them everything about our plans, our defenses, our strategies." "Yes, he probably will," Daran agreed. "Which means we'll have to be better than our plans, more resilient than our defenses, and more clever than our strategies." The news of Cassius's defection reached the war room within hours, forcing a complete revision of their tactical preparations. Every plan that the Duke had been privy to needed to be abandoned or modified. Every position he knew about had to be considered compromised. But rather than despair, the military commanders found themselves energized by the challenge. Sarai's unconventional thinking had already forced them to abandon traditional approaches, and Cassius's betrayal simply accelerated that process. "Let him tell Caven what he knows," General Marcus said grimly. "He knows our old plans, our predictable responses. He doesn't know what we're capable of when we stop thinking like traditional soldiers and start thinking like survivors." As dawn broke over the eastern desert on what would likely be the last day of peace Caleth would know for some time, Sarai stood on the palace balcony that had become her favorite thinking place. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, she could see the dust clouds that marked Caven's advancing army. Tomorrow, the battle would begin in earnest. Tomorrow, she would discover whether the prophecy that had transformed her from slave to heir would prove blessing or curse. Tomorrow, the empire that had given her a home would look to her for salvation. But today, for just a few more hours, she could stand in the morning sunshine and feel like the child she had never really been allowed to be. Today, she could hold on to hope and the love of the man who had chosen to see worth where others saw only brokenness. The War Council map awaited her return, marked with the movements of armies and the weight of destiny. But the girl who would study it was no longer the frightened slave who had stood on an auction platform, believing herself worthless. She was Sarai of Caleth, daughter by choice, if not by blood, heir to an empire and keeper of an ancient prophecy, and she was ready for whatever fire would test them all. The Battle of the Golden Dunes began before sunrise, not with the clash of armies, but with the whispered communications of carefully positioned scouts. Hidden among the natural rock formations that dotted the desert landscape, Caleth's forces watched as Warlord Caven's massive army approached through the pre-dawn darkness, their torches creating a river of light that stretched back toward the horizon. Sarai crouched behind a sandstone outcropping with a small unit of elite soldiers, her hand gripping a polished bronze mirror that caught and reflected the early morning light. The signal mirror had become her primary tool for coordinating the complex battle plan, its flashes carrying coded messages across vast distances faster than any messenger could ride. In her other hand, she held a spyglass, studying the enemy formations with eyes that had learned to see patterns where others saw only chaos. "They're moving exactly as we predicted," she whispered to Captain Theron, the young officer who commanded her escort unit. "Caven is keeping his main force in the center, with cavalry wings to prevent flanking maneuvers. He's fighting the battle. He knows how to win." The captain, initially skeptical about taking orders from a child, had quickly learned to trust Sarai's tactical instincts. "And our people are in position?" Sarai adjusted the mirror's angle, sending a series of light signals to distant positions. The responses came back immediately, brief flashes from hidden locations throughout the dunes that confirmed all units were ready. "Phase 1 begins now," she said, then added with a slight smile that reminded everyone present just how young she was. "Let's show them what happens when you underestimate the broken." The first part of Sarai's plan unfolded with devastating precision. As Kavan's army advanced into the deep desert, pursuing what appeared to be Kaleth's retreating forces, they found themselves harassed by attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Small units of mounted archers would appear from behind sand dunes, loose a volley of arrows, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Supply trains were ambushed by groups that melted back into the desert like mirages. More frustratingly for Kavan's commanders, their own maps proved useless in the shifting sands. Wells that should have contained water were found dry or poisoned. Paths that looked clear from a distance turned out to lead into box canyons or unstable ground that could swallow horses and men alike. "The desert is fighting against us," one of Kavan's lieutenants reported as the morning wore on, and casualties mounted without any significant enemy engagement. "It's as if the very land rejects our presence." Kavan himself, a brutal man whose reputation for cruelty had earned him fear rather than loyalty, grew increasingly frustrated as his careful battle plans crumbled against an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. "Where is their main force?" he demanded, studying reports from his scouts. "They can't have simply vanished into the sand." Duke Cassius, riding beside the warlord as both guide and advisor, pointed toward a distant ridge where banners could be seen fluttering in the desert wind. "There, the Imperial standards. Daran is making his stand at the Sunward Heights, just as I predicted, but Sarai, watching through her spyglass from a concealed position much closer to the enemy than anyone on either side realized, smiled grimly at Cassius's misunderstanding. The banners he had spotted were indeed Imperial colors, but they flew over a force of fewer than 2,000 men, barely a tenth of Kaleth's actual army. "Signal the diversionary force," she told Captain Daran, using her mirror to send a complex pattern of flashes toward the distant ridge. "Tell them to make it look desperate but not hopeless. We need Kavan to commit his reserves, but not so quickly that he realizes it's a trap." The feigned battle at Sunward Heights began with all the drama that Sarai had choreographed. Kaleth's forces appeared to be making a last-ditch defense of a tactically important position, their resistance fierce but ultimately doomed against overwhelming numbers. Kavan, seeing what appeared to be his chance to end the war in a single decisive stroke, committed his elite units to the assault. It was exactly what Sarai had been waiting for. "Phase 2, she whispered, and her mirror began flashing the signal that would unleash the real battle. From positions that Kavan's army had passed hours earlier, thinking them empty desert, emerged the true strength of Kaleth's forces. The refugees who had fled past enemy lines revealed themselves as disguised soldiers, cutting off retreat routes and supply lines. Hidden camps that had been invisible in the desert landscape suddenly bristled with armed men moving with the precision of a plan months in the making. Warlord Govan realized his error when reports began flooding in from all directions. Enemy forces attacking his rear guard, his supply trains under assault, his communication lines severed. The army that he thought was trapped and desperate had somehow surrounded him in the middle of an empty desert. "It's impossible," he snarled, staring at the tactical situation that had seemed so favorable just minutes earlier. "An army can't simply appear from nothing." "Unless it was never really gone," Duke Cassius said quietly, and for the first time genuine fear crept into his voice as he began to understand the true scope of what they faced. "Unless everything we thought we knew was exactly what they wanted us to think." But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. As Kavan's forces found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move, a small figure appeared on a ridge overlooking the main battlefield. Even at a distance, her profile was unmistakable. The slight frame, The careful way she moved to accommodate her physical limitations, the absolute confidence with which she directed the complex dance of battle. "The crippled girl," one of Caven's officers breathed, pointing toward the distant figure. "She's commanding them. All of this, it's her strategy." Warlord Caven stared through his own spyglass at the child who had outmaneuvered him so completely, and for the first time in his brutal career, he felt something approaching respect for an enemy. But respect would not save him from the consequences of underestimating what he had dismissed as broken goods. The turning point came when Duke Cassius, witnessing the systematic destruction of everything he thought he understood about warfare, made a decision that would echo through the remaining hours of battle. Spurring his horse away from Warlord Caven's increasingly desperate command group, he rode directly toward the ridge where Sarai stood directing the complex symphony of coordinated attacks. In her small hand, she clutched the jade dove of peace, a carved talisman that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep through all her trials. The small dove, no larger than her thumb, had become her touchstone during moments of doubt, a reminder of the choice between vengeance and compassion that defined who she chose to be. "Sarai," Cassius called out as he approached under a makeshift flag of truce, his voice carrying across the wind-swept sand. "I would speak with you." The soldiers surrounding her tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Sarai raised her hand for calm. "Let him approach," she said quietly. "But keep him covered." When Cassius reached the base of the ridge, he dismounted and climbed the rocky slope on foot, his movements showing the exhaustion and defeat that had settled over him like a cloak. When he finally stood before her, this man who had once commanded armies found himself looking up at a child whose eyes held more wisdom than his decades of experience. "You've won," he said simply. "Caven's army is finished. His supply lines are cut, his communications destroyed, his forces scattered across terrain they don't understand. Within hours, they'll be forced to surrender or die in the desert." "Yes," Sarai agreed calmly. "That was the plan." Cassius studied her face, searching for the gloating or cruelty he might have expected from a victor addressing a defeated enemy. Instead, he found only a quiet sadness that seemed far too mature for her years. "Why did you let me approach?" he asked. "You could have had your archers cut me down the moment I left Caven's lines, because you're not my enemy." "Duke Cassius," Sarai replied, her words causing visible confusion on the older man's weathered features. "You're a man who loves his empire so much that you convinced yourself betrayal was loyalty. That's not evil. That's just fear wearing the mask of principle." The words hit Cassius like physical blows, stripping away the justifications he had built around his actions and leaving him face to face with the truth he had been avoiding. "I tried to destroy you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I called you worthless, unworthy, dangerous to everything I held sacred. You tried to destroy what you thought I represented," Sarai corrected gently. "Change. The end of the world, you understood. But Duke Cassius, the world you're trying to preserve, one where worth is measured by birth rather than character, that world was already dying. I didn't kill it. I'm just helping something better be born from its ashes." As if to punctuate her words, a commotion erupted from the valley below. Warlord Caven, realizing that his position had become hopeless, had launched a final desperate assault directly toward the capital city. But his forces, depleted and demoralized, ran straight into the carefully prepared defenses that Daran and General Marcus had established as the final layer of protection. "Your emperor fights well for a man supposedly weakened by compassion," Cassius observed, watching as Caven's elite guard was systematically dismantled by Caleth's disciplined formations. "Papa is the strongest person I know," Sarai said simply. "Strong enough to choose love over fear, mercy over cruelty, hope over despair. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that builds empires rather than just conquering them." The final confrontation came when Warlord Caven himself, his army in full retreat and his dreams of conquest crumbling around him, spotted Sarai on her ridge, and made a personal charge toward her position. He had decided that if he could not win the battle, he could at least eliminate the architect of his defeat. But Caven had made the same mistake that everyone seemed to make when looking at Sarai. He saw only her physical limitations and missed the strength that lay beneath. As his horse thundered up the rocky slope, she calmly stepped aside, using his momentum and the treacherous footing to send both horse and rider tumbling down the opposite side of the ridge. When Caven struggled to his feet, battered and bruised but still clutching his sword, he found himself surrounded by Kaleth's soldiers. But it was Sarai who approached him, walking carefully down the slope with her distinctive limp, her jade dove clutched in one hand and her other hand extended in a gesture of peace. "Surrender," she said simply. "Your army is defeated, your allies have abandoned you, and your cause is lost. But you don't have to die here in the sand." Caven stared at her in disbelief. "You offer mercy? After everything I've done, I offer you the chance to choose who you want to be," Sarai replied. "The warlord who died in pride and hatred, or the man who lived to learn that strength comes in many forms." For a long moment, the desert was silent, except for the wind moving through the dunes. Then slowly, Warlord Caven laid down his sword and knelt in the sand before a 7-year-old girl who had just taught him the difference between conquest and victory. The prophecy was fulfilled. The realm had been tested by fire and found worthy, and the broken child had indeed healed what was divided. But perhaps most importantly, she had done it not through violence or vengeance, but through the radical act of choosing compassion even for those who had shown her none. The turning point came when Duke Cassius, witnessing the systematic destruction of everything he thought he understood about warfare, made a decision that would echo through the remaining hours of battle. Spurring his horse away from Warlord Caven's increasingly desperate command group, he rode directly toward the ridge, where Sarai stood directing the complex symphony of coordinated attacks. In her small hand, she clutched the jade dove of peace, a carved talisman that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep through all her trials. The small dove, no larger than her thumb, had become her touchstone during moments of doubt, a reminder of the choice between vengeance and compassion that defined who she chose to be. "Sarai," Cassius called out as he approached under a makeshift flag of truce, his voice carrying across the wind-swept sand. "I would speak with you." The soldiers surrounding her tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Sarai raised her hand for calm. "Let him approach," she said quietly, "but keep him covered." When Cassius reached the base of the ridge, he dismounted and climbed the rocky slope on foot, his movements showing the exhaustion and defeat that had settled over him like a cloak. When he finally stood before her, this man who had once commanded armies found himself looking up at a child whose eyes held more wisdom than his decades of experience. "You've won," he said simply. "Caven's army is finished. His supply lines are cut, his communications destroyed. His forces scattered across terrain they don't understand. Within hours, they'll be forced to surrender or die in the desert." "Yes," Sarai agreed calmly. "That was the plan." Cassius studied her face, searching for the gloating or cruelty he might have expected from a victor addressing a defeated enemy. Instead, he found only a quiet sadness that seemed far too mature for her years. "Why did you let me approach?" he asked. "You could have had your archers cut me down the moment I left Caven's lines." "Because you're not my enemy." "Duke Cassius," Sarai replied, her words causing visible confusion on the older man's weathered features. "You're a man who loves his empire so much that you convinced yourself betrayal was loyalty. That's not evil, that's just fear wearing the mask of principle." The words hit Cassius like physical blows, stripping away the justifications he had built around his actions and leaving him face to face with the truth he had been avoiding. "I tried to destroy you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I called you worthless, unworthy, dangerous to everything I held sacred. You tried to destroy what you thought I represented," Sarai corrected gently. "Change, the end of the world you understood. But Duke Cassius, the world you're trying to preserve, one where worth is measured by birth rather than character, that world was already dying. I didn't kill it. I'm just helping something better be born from its ashes." As if to punctuate her words, a commotion erupted from the valley below. Warlord Caven, realizing that his position had become hopeless, had launched a final desperate assault directly toward the capital city. But his forces, depleted and demoralized, ran straight into the carefully prepared defenses that Daran and General Marcus had established as the final layer of protection. "Your emperor fights well for a man supposedly weakened by compassion," Cassius observed, watching as Caven's elite guard was systematically dismantled by Caleth's disciplined formations. "Papa is the strongest person I know," Sarai said simply. "Strong enough to choose love over fear, mercy over cruelty, hope over despair. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that builds empires rather than just conquering them." The final confrontation came when Warlord Caven himself, his army in full retreat and his dreams of conquest crumbling around him, spotted Sarai on her ridge and made a personal charge toward her position. He had decided that if he could not win the battle, he could at least eliminate the architect of his defeat. But Caven had made the same mistake that everyone seemed to make when looking at Sarai. He saw only her physical limitations and missed the strength that lay beneath. As his horse thundered up the rocky slope, she calmly stepped aside, using his momentum and the treacherous footing to send both horse and rider tumbling down the opposite side of the ridge. When Caven struggled to his feet, battered and bruised, but still clutching his sword, he found himself surrounded by Caleth's soldiers. But it was Sarai who approached him, walking carefully down the slope with her distinctive limp. Her jade dove clutched in one hand and her other hand extended in a gesture of peace. "Surrender," she said simply. "Your army is defeated, your allies have abandoned you, and your cause is lost. But you don't have to die here in the sand." Caven stared at her in disbelief. "You offer mercy? After everything I've done." "I offer you the chance to choose who you want to be," Sarai replied. "The warlord who died in pride and hatred, or the man who lived to learn that strength comes in many forms." For a long moment, the desert was silent, except for the wind moving through the dunes. Then slowly, Warlord Caven laid down his sword and knelt in the sand before a 7-year-old girl who had just taught him the difference between conquest and victory. The prophecy was fulfilled. The realm had been tested by fire and found worthy, and the broken child had indeed healed what was divided. But perhaps most importantly, she had done it not through violence or vengeance, but through the radical act of choosing compassion, even for those who had shown her none.